Over the past 4 years, I've made 3 videos about the most evil musicians. I think by now I've covered pretty much all the most well-known ones. So now we're moving on to the more obscure evil musicians. But this video will be different from the others, because this time, all of the musicians I'm talking about are killers. Here are 5 more of the most evil musicians. Joe Franklin was the guitarist for Goat Lord, a Las Vegas extreme metal band that started in 1985. Like a lot of death metal bands, they like to give their songs and albums rather edgy and gross sounding names. One of their demos was titled Sodomize the Goat, and one of their songs was called Unholy Black Slut. By 1991, internal disagreements about the band's musical direction led to their vocalist leaving, and by the mid-90s they had broken up, though they maintained a cult following in the underground metal scene. After the band ended, Franklin took a different path. He became the administrator of bloodshows.com, a shock website that started as 4girlsonemouth.com. The site hosted gore videos, death footage, and extreme pornographic content. Franklin actively managed the site's comment sections and would delete posts that mentioned his real name, though he'd already revealed it himself. According to posts on the site, Franklin claimed some of the most disturbing content was created specifically to end the trend of shock videos that became popular after 2 Girls 1 Cup. In 2014, Franklin tried to get Goat Lord back together for a German metal festival. The reunion failed. By then, he was 46 years old, still living in the same Las Vegas house his mother had owned before she died in 2007. Neighbors knew him as the heavy-set guy with long hair who wore dirty clothes and would build bike ramps for the local kids in his garage. They'd give him odd jobs around the neighborhood when he complained about being broke. Something changed in September 2015. Franklin started selling off his possessions. He boarded up his windows with street signs and wooden planks. Police had to check on him multiple times that month, using a bullhorn to get him to come out and prove he was still alive. The neighbors started avoiding him. One said he started giving off an eerie feeling for months, especially when he was around children. On the morning of October 2nd, 2015, Franklin walked 2 houses down to where Jennifer Donoso had lived with her 3 children. He shot Jennifer around 7 a.m. while her kids were in the house. Her daughter ran to a neighbor for help. When Franklin left, he took Donoso's 8-year-old son Lex with him. Police arrived within 4 minutes of the 911 call, but by the time they heard more gunshots coming from Franklin's house, they knew they were too late. SWAT officers couldn't establish contact with him. When they entered through his garage, they found both bodies. Franklin had shot the boy, then himself. The house was in complete disarray, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been barricading himself in it for weeks. Police said there had been previous disputes between Franklin and Donoso, though they never released specifics about what those disputes involved. The metal community's reaction was immediate shock and disgust. Former bandmates distanced themselves, but by that point none of them had been in contact with him for years anyway. The underground metal forums that had once celebrated Goat Lord's weird, sludgy sound now had to reckon with what their former guitarist had done. A GoFundMe was set up for Donoso's surviving children. The 2 kids who witnessed their mother's murder and lost their brother had to be placed with family members. The Las Vegas neighborhood where it happened tried to return to normal, but neighbors told reporters they'd known something was going to happen. They'd watched Franklin deteriorate over those final weeks, selling everything he owned, boarding up his house like he was preparing for something. The Blood Show's website continued operating for some time after Franklin's death, though management changed hands. Users on the site's forums debated whether to memorialize him or scrub his presence entirely. Some pointed out the irony of a man who'd spent years curating real death videos, becoming the subject of the kind of violent news story his site would have featured. Franklin left behind no manifesto, no explanation for why he targeted Donoso and her son. It was reported that he had no criminal record in Clark County before that October morning. Whatever drove him to walk those few yards between houses with a gun, whatever made him take that 8-year-old boy, died with him in that garage. Whenever someone talks about Goat Lord now, they have to include a footnote about October 2nd, 2015. The band that was already a curiosity in the extreme metal underground became something else entirely. Not because of their music or their influence on death metal, but because their guitarist murdered a mother and her child before killing himself in a garage in Las Vegas, leaving behind a website full of death videos and a neighborhood that saw it coming. Mario Macchioni was born in Milan in April 1980. By the time he was 15, He'd already formed a death metal band called Ferocity and given himself the stage name that matched. He played guitar, screamed vocals, and told people he was a psychic medium who could contact the dead. The Midnight Pub in Milan was where the metalheads gathered in the mid-1990s. Macchione was there most nights with his band and a rotating group of friends who called themselves the Beasts of Satan. They weren't really a formal organization at first, just metalheads who got high together, talked about Satan, and tried to outdo each other with how dark they could be. Macchione stood out because he actually seemed to believe it. He'd tell people he had visions, that he could see things others couldn't. He convinced grieving people he could speak to their dead relatives. In 1996, a construction worker named Christian Frigio started hanging around with the group. His father had just died, and Macchione told him he could make contact. Frigio spent months with Macchione and the Beasts of Satan, sitting through seances and rituals. On November 14, 1996, Frigio disappeared. His body was never found. Years later, Macchione would claim the group killed him. Then he'd take it back. Nobody has ever been charged. Fabio Tollis was different from the others. He was only 16 in 1998 and played bass and wrote metal songs but still lived with his parents. He joined Ferocity as their bassist and considered Macchione his best friend. Fabio was also dating Chiara Marino, a 19-year-old shop assistant. She wasn't really part of the scene, but she'd come to the Midnight to be with Fabio. Macchione started telling others that Chiara was the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. Not as a joke or a metaphor, he said he'd had visions about it. She needed to be sacrificed to Satan. That was the word he used. Sacrifice. The group's leader, Nicola Sapone, agreed. So did Andrea Volpe and the others. They tried once on New Year's Eve 1997. They locked Fabio and Chiara in a car and threw a firecracker into the gas tank. The car caught fire but they escaped. The group told them it was just a prank, a test of courage, and the couple believed them. On January 17, 1998, at the Midnight Pub, Fabio and Chiara were drinking beer and listening to bands. Around midnight, Sapone forced Fabio to call his father and say he was staying at Chiara's place. Michele Tollis, Fabio's father, heard something wrong in his son's voice and drove to the pub. By the time he arrived, they were gone. The group had taken them to the woods near Somma Lombardo, about 30 miles from Milan. They were high on cocaine and alcohol. Volpe told Fabio what was about to happen. They were going to sacrifice Chiara and he was going to watch. When Fabio tried to protect her, multiple members of the group attacked him. Macchione took a hammer and beat his supposed best friend to death, while Volpe and Sapone held him down. Chiara was stabbed repeatedly in the chest. The whole thing took minutes. After they were dead, Sapone grabbed handfuls of chestnut leaves and stuffed them down the corpses' throats. They dug a large grave and threw both bodies in. Then they danced on the fresh dirt, laughing and screaming, "Now you're both zombies. Try to get out of this hole if you dare." Macchione went home that night and acted like nothing happened. The police assumed Fabio and Chiara had run away together. Michele Tollis did not believe it. He spent 6 years investigating on his own, going to metal festivals across Europe, showing people photos of him. The other parents gave up. Michele never did. 6 years passed. The Beasts of Satan kept meeting, kept getting high, and kept playing their games. In 2004, they decided another member, named Mariangela Pizzotta, knew too much about the murders. Volpe shot her in the face, and they buried her alive in a greenhouse, still breathing when the dirt covered her. This time they got caught. Volpe was arrested after a car accident, and during interrogation, he broke. He confessed to killing Pizzotta, and then told them about Fabio and Chiara. When Michele Tollis saw Andrea Volpe's name in the news, he went straight to the police with 6 years of research. The police finally listened. Volpe led them to the bodies in the woods. During the investigation, Macchione confessed. He admitted to beating Fabio to death with the hammer. He called himself the medium of the group and said the Virgin Mary revelation had come to him in a vision. He showed no remorse for killing his best friend. At trial in 2005, the prosecutors wanted Macchione in prison for his role in the murders, but the court decided he was a secondary participant. Volpe got 30 years. Sapone got life. Others got between 24 and 29 years. Macchione was cleared of the worst charges, but still convicted for his involvement. In 2007, he was sentenced to 16 years. Prison didn't stop his music career. In 2009, while locked up in Milan, he started a solo project under his own name. He formed bands with other prisoners, and he recorded albums from his cell. The metal underground still distributed his music. Some fans knew who he was and what he'd done. Others had no idea they were listening to someone who'd beaten his teenage friend to death with a hammer in the forest. In 2017, after serving 10 years, Macchioni was released on parole. He went straight back to making music. The Italian authorities suspected the Beasts of Satan in at least 14 other deaths around Milan between 1996 and 2004. Suspicious suicides, disappearances, people burned alive, or found hanged. Macchioni was questioned about several of them. He'd implicate others, then retract his statements. The only murders that stuck were Fabio and Chiara's. Today, Mario Macchioni is 45 years old. Italian law says he paid his debt to society. 10 years for helping to murder 2 teenagers who trusted him. Fabio Tollis would be in his 40s now, if his best friend hadn't beaten him to death with a hammer for a satanic sacrifice that Macchioni claimed came to him in a vision. Matthias Schaumann, known in the black metal underground as Carathorn, was a 32-year-old unemployed mechanic from Leer in northern Germany. He played guitar in a local black metal band called Carpe Noctem from 1997 until the group split in 2004. The band never achieved much recognition beyond their local scene. They played the kind of raw, aggressive black metal that was common in Germany's underground during that period. After the band broke up, Schaumann kept collecting weapons, maintained his fascination with black metal culture, and spent most of his time on metal forums and working on computers. Schaumann had been friends with Bianca Bruss for years. She was 27, worked as a medical assistant at the local hospital, and lived a normal life outside the metal scene. Schaumann had developed romantic feelings for her that she'd never returned. Friends later said he'd been obsessed with her for a long time, constantly trying to win her over despite her clear lack of interest. She kept him as a friend, probably feeling sorry for him, but made it clear repeatedly that she wasn't interested in anything romantic. On February 20th, 2008, Schaumann invited Bianca to his apartment in Leer. He asked her to come over many times before, and she'd usually refuse or make an excuse. This time she agreed to visit, maybe thinking she was just helping a lonely friend. When she arrived that evening, Schaumann made one final attempt to convince her to be with him. When she rejected him again, just as she'd done many times before, something in him snapped. He attacked her in his living room. Despite her attempts to fight back, Schaumann was much larger and stronger. He wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her. He kept squeezing long after she stopped struggling, making sure she was dead. Then he dragged her body to another room. What happened next went beyond murder into something much darker. Schaumann grabbed a machete from his weapons collection. He positioned Bianca's body on the floor and began cutting through her neck with the blade. It took multiple strikes to completely sever her head from her body. He didn't stop there. Schaumann spent the next several hours arranging and rearranging the corpse and severed head in different positions. He stripped the body naked and placed the head in various locations around the room, sometimes next to the body, sometimes separate from it. He took approximately 20 photographs of these arrangements with a digital camera. The photos showed the headless corpse sprawled in different poses, the severed head placed at different angles. That same night, Schaumann logged onto a metal forum and uploaded the photographs. He posted them without much explanation, just letting the images speak for themselves. Forum members initially thought they were fake, some kind of elaborate special effect for a metal band's promotional material, but something about the images seemed too real. Several members reported the posts to authorities. After posting the photos, Schaumann decided he wasn't finished with his violence. He packed Bianca's severed head into his backpack. He then spread gasoline around his apartment to set it on fire. As flames began consuming the building, he got into his car with the head still in his backpack and drove away. A neighbor who saw the fire and Schaumann leaving called the police. Fire crews responding to the blaze discovered what remained of Bianca's headless body in the apartment. Police immediately began pursuing Schaumann's vehicle. The chase didn't last long. Schaumann drove through the streets of Leer at increasing speeds. He showed no signs of slowing down or pulling over. Then he saw an oncoming semi-truck on the road ahead. Instead of swerving to avoid it, Schaumann accelerated and drove directly into the truck's path. The collision happened at high speed. Schaumann's car was completely destroyed on impact. He died instantly, his body crushed in the wreckage. Police found Bianca's severed head in the backpack, among the twisted metal and broken glass. The truck driver survived with minor injuries. Because Schaumann died in the crash, there was never a trial. German authorities conducted a full investigation and confirmed all the details of the murder through forensic evidence and the photographs he posted online. The images he uploaded became infamous in certain corners of the internet, though most sites removed them quickly. Bianca Bruss was buried in a cemetery in Leer. Her family requested privacy and never spoke publicly about what happened. The apartment building where the murder occurred was repaired after the fire damage, though locals say nobody wanted to rent that particular unit for years afterwards. The case remains one of the most disturbing murders in recent German history, not because of any particular sophistication or planning, but because of the sheer brutality and the grotesque photography session that followed. Schaumann turned the murder of someone who tried to be his friend into a spectacle for strangers on the internet to witness. His death in the car crash meant Bianca's family never got the chance to see him face justice in court. They never got to hear him explain why he did what he did, though the explanation probably wouldn't have brought any comfort anyway. Schaumann took those answers with him when he drove into that truck, leaving behind only horror, grief, and those terrible photographs. Jim Gordon was one of the most sought-after session drummers in rock history. Between 1963 and 1978, he played on hundreds of recordings that defined popular music. He played on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man, and Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Are Made for Walking, all of which featured his distinctive drumming. He also co-wrote Layla with Eric Clapton, creating the unforgettable piano coda that still gets played on classic rock stations every single day. While other drummers showed off with complicated fills, Gordon knew exactly when to hit hard and when to pull back. Producers loved him because he could nail a track in 1 or 2 takes. By the early 70s, Gordon had become Eric Clapton's go-to drummer. He toured with Clapton's band, Derek and the Dominos, and also played on George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, and worked with John Lennon, Frank Zappa, and Steely Dan. He was earning serious money and living in a nice house in North Hollywood. Musicians wanted to work with him, and record labels specifically requested him for their biggest projects. But Gordon was hearing voices, and not metaphorical artistic voices, but actual voices in his head, telling him things. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia in the late 60s, but kept working through it. The voices got worse when he drank or used cocaine, which he did frequently. Band members started noticing his behavior getting stranger. He'd have conversations with people who weren't there. He'd often become paranoid, accusing friends of plotting against him. During recording sessions, he'd repeatedly stop playing and stare at nothing. His mother, Oza Marie Gordon, was 71 years old in June 1983. She lived alone in the same North Hollywood apartment building where Jim rented a unit. They'd always been close. She supported his music career from the beginning, going to his shows when he was just starting out in local bands. On the night of June 3rd, Gordon knocked on her door. When she answered, he attacked her with a hammer. He struck her repeatedly in the head. The blows fractured her skull in multiple places. After she stopped moving, Gordon hit her several more times. Then he picked up a butcher knife from her kitchen and stabbed her 3 times in the chest, with the blade puncturing her heart and lungs. Gordon left her body on the floor and walked back to his apartment. He called his girlfriend and confessed. She didn't believe him at first and thought maybe he was having another episode, but something in his voice made her call the police. When officers arrived, they found Gordon sitting calmly in his living room. He immediately told them what he'd done. "I killed my mother," he said. The police found Oza Marie's body where Gordon said it would be. Her skull was caved in from the hammer blows, and the knife was still in her chest. Blood had pooled around her body and soaked into the carpet. Crime scene photographers documented massive trauma to her head and face. The medical examiner counted over 10 distinct hammer strikes. During questioning, Gordon claimed his mother was sending him messages through the television. He said she was controlling his mind, making him do things he didn't want to do. The only way to stop her was to kill her. He showed no remorse during the interrogation. When detectives asked him why he used a hammer and a knife, he said he wanted to make sure she was really dead. The trial was straightforward. Gordon's lawyers argued insanity, which wasn't hard to prove given his documented history of mental illness. Psychiatrists testified about his schizophrenia diagnosis, his long history of hallucinations, and his previous hospitalizations. The prosecution didn't dispute that Gordon was mentally ill, but argued he still understood that killing was wrong. Gordon testified in his own defense. He spoke calmly about the voices, about how his mother had been replaced by an evil spirit that was tormenting him. He described the murder in detail without showing any emotion. When the prosecutor showed him photos of his mother's body, Gordon just nodded and confirmed that yes, that's what he had done. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, but accepted that he was mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to 16 years to life with the possibility of parole. In prison, Gordon continued making music. He formed bands with other inmates and gave drum lessons. Guards reported he was a model prisoner when properly medicated, but he'd sometimes refuse his antipsychotic drugs, and then the voices would return. He'd become agitated, paranoid, and sometimes violent towards other inmates. Gordon had been eligible for parole since 1981. He'd been denied 13 times. Each hearing followed the same pattern. The parole board would review the brutality of the crime, consider his mental state, and listen to his expressions of remorse. Gordon would usually cry during these hearings, saying he missed his mother every day and wished he could take it back. The board noted his good behavior in prison, but concluded he still posed a risk to public safety. At his last hearing in 2021, Gordon was 75 years old. He told the board he'd still hear voices sometimes, but that the medication helped. He said he thought about his mother constantly, then he remembered what he did to her. His next parole hearing would have been in 2026, but he died in 2023 at the age of 77. Jim Gordon may have been one of the most talented and celebrated session musicians ever, and played on some iconic recordings, but the brutal murder of his mother, caused by the voices in his head, has forever tarnished his legacy.
I'm gonna murder my baby. Yes, I'm gonna murder my baby.
Auburn Pat Hare grew up on an Arkansas farm and learned guitar from Joe Willie Wilkins in his teens. By 1952, at the age of 22, he was Sam Phillips' favorite session guitarist at Sun Records in Memphis. Pat discovered something that nobody else was doing. He'd crank his amplifier past its breaking point until the speaker cone tore and the sound came out distorted. On James Cotton's Cotton Crop Blues in 1954, Pat played what some have called the first heavy metal guitar solo. This was years before anyone else figured it out. 3 weeks before Elvis walked into Sun's studio for the first time, Pat recorded 2 songs of his own. On May 14, 1954, he recorded Bonus Pay and the infamous I'm Gonna Murder My Baby. The lyrics were blunt. Pat sang about killing a woman for cheating and lying. Sam Phillips listened to the playback and locked it away. The tape stayed in the Sun vaults for 20 years. Pat moved to Chicago in 1956 to play with Muddy Waters, but Pat was a drunk, and when he drank, he turned vicious. He shot at Howlin' Wolf during an argument and threatened to kill George Buford, Muddy Waters' harmonica player. Other musicians learned to disappear when Pat started drinking, until Muddy Waters eventually fired him in 1963. Pat ended up in Minneapolis, broke and living with Agnes Winyee in a ground floor apartment at 3025 Portland Avenue. Agnes was 49 and separated from her husband. Pat was 32 and telling people he washed windows for money. On December 15, 1963, Pat had been drinking since morning while a female friend drove in between bars and houses. He got back to the apartment around 9 that night, drunk. Agnes confronted him, asking him where he'd been and who he was with. Pat told police she was nagging him, though Agnes would dispute this later. Pat pulled out his pistol and fired 5 shots into a kitchen wall. The bullets lodged into the plaster. Then he turned the gun on Agnes and shot her multiple times. The neighbors heard everything and called the police. Officer James Hendricks arrived first and broke through the door. Pat shot him immediately, with Hendricks never getting the chance to draw his own weapon. The officer's partner came right through behind him and returned fire, hitting Pat several times. Hendricks died in the ambulance. Pat survived his wounds, and so did Agnes initially. She stayed conscious long enough to tell detectives her version of the events. For 5 weeks, she fought to stay alive in a hospital bed, but on January 22, 1964, Agnes Winyee died from gunshot wounds. Pat's trial was brief. He pleaded guilty to third-degree murder for Agnes and got 25 years. For killing Officer Hendricks, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder, resulting in a life sentence. Meanwhile, in 1974, a bootlegger found Pat's old Sun recording and released I'm Gonna Murder My Baby on an underground compilation called 706 Blues. Record collectors passed around copies, whispering about the guitarist who sang about murder in 1954 and then committed it in 1963. Robert Palmer, who wrote Muddy Waters' biography, called the song The Texas Chainsaw Massacre on a 3-minute vinyl disc. The guitar sounded like violence, and the lyrics were violent, and Pat made them real. On September 26, 1980, Pat Hare died of lung cancer in Stillwater Prison at 49 years old. He'd been in prison for 16 years. Pat Hare was of course not the only person ever to write a song about killing someone, but he was one of the few who would later go ahead and make his lyrics a reality. And that's the end of the video, folks. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider supporting me on Patreon. All patrons get early ad-free access to videos, and higher tiers get their name on the board and a shout out. I'd like to give a special thanks to all of my patrons for their support, especially those whose names you're seeing on the screen now, particularly Kyle, BAN, John, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Count Lagula, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Squishy, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Brody Millers, Belsie Gell, Stimulate, in Chris Cesarius, and of course, Dick the Cock Johnson and the Woodmaster at WrestleMania X69 or maybe not dude. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.